we've invited everybody in the 208 highest consuming trusts to these talks, but we've split the invitation into two, and I see we've got representation from both sides, from trusts that are in the HyNet area and therefore have a direct interest in what's going on now, as well as some of the others that have joined us, and we're pleased to see you, who will see what's going on. Now, there is a second hydrogen talk in 2 weeks' time, where we look at the East Coast hydrogen, which I see some of us will affect some others that are here, and will be a slightly wider discussion than this one. HyNet's the first and leading hydrogen project, so we've started with that one first. So we've got Cadent, who will distribute the gas, who will talk first. We then got Vertex, who are generating the hydrogen. They'll tell you a bit about that. And then we've got Grenian, who produce hydrogen from electrolysis, just to give you an alternative view of how that's produced and what's required. The objective is that you should have a chance to look at hydrogen as an opportunity, as one of your opportunities to net zero, and start to evaluate where it works for you. Now, in terms of questions, please raise them on the chat as we go along. All the speakers will be keeping an eye on the chat, and probably more than me, who'll be flicking slides through. And we'll attempt to answer the questions on the chat, or we'll pick some of them up if they're mutual questions at the end and try and deal with them. So there we are. So I'm going to, we have NHS England on today's call. Mary's on leave. She asked me to cut her slides down anyway, so I'm not talking much about it, other than we're really looking at heat in hospitals rather than electricity, which has its own decarbonisation plan. And the routes to decarbonisation that we're looking at, particularly for the big users in the NHS, are geothermal energy, see us next week, hydrogen, which is this week and then the week after next, district energy that's green, which will be a following week, and then other technologies, one of which is decarbonisation of gas at the point of use, which is an early stage of development, but we're looking for trial sites. And then other technologies such as the ones that come to mind, like heat pumps and the rest of it that we're all busy with at the moment. Just so you've got the sort of context to it, we have a map of all the 209 trusts. Stephen, who's on the call, did this map, and we places each of the trusts in, and it looks at the sites. The left-hand graph looks at all the sites, the hospital sites that we think could benefit from hydrogen. And if you look at the right-hand one, that's a zoom in on the HyNet area and the trusts that are in the HyNet area, which we think could use this as a route to net zero. And that's why this is one of the smaller groups, because there are about 20 trusts affected. The list you see here and the list you see on the Cadence slide in a minute vary slightly, because there's the issue of timescales and other things to consider, which we'll feed in a minute. So I'll pass over to Martin. Martin will take us through the HyNet offering, because Martin's the man who's going to get the gas to you. Over to you, Martin. You could just introduce yourself briefly and then tell me when you want to move on.
Thank you, Clive, and thank you for inviting us to talk to your colleagues today. So I'm Martin Shannon. I'm Head of Commercial Services in Cadent Gas. Over the last sort of 24 months, I've been working on HyNet, on what we call the client side, to the demand side. So really getting industry engaged in terms of how they're going to meet their sustainability programs and what's their pathway to achieve sort of net zero in line with government's ambitions by 2050. If you move to the next slide, please, Clive. So government has supported hydrogen all the way back since November 20. They introduced the 10-point plan, which was for a green industrial revolution. And then from there going forward, we've had the hydrogen strategy, which came out in August 2021. And that was about building these track 1 carbon capture and use clusters, of which HyNet is one of them. And when we say CCUS, that's carbon capture and use. So effectively what that is to produce hydrogen. You can either do it through electrolysis, which is electricity, or you can do it via cracking natural gas and capturing the CO2. And that's what HyNet is going to be producing initially. We've also had further strategies come out from government about building back greener following COVID. Can hydrogen also play its role in heat, so decarbonising heat in domestic heat, and all of this is underpinned by the hydrogen production business models which government is been consulting on. And interestingly, only yesterday they did land on a minded to position on how they're actually going to fund the rollout of the actual network, which is going to be a regulated asset base type model, which is really important because that then allows the investors to actually move beyond what we call designing the network to actually into construction. And we're hopefully going to have these assets in the ground, you know, earliest 2026, but all the way through into the early 2030s. Can we move to the next slide, please, Clive? So the HyNet Consortium is a very strong consortium which consists of the partners on which you can see on the slide. Progressive Energy have been very pivotal in terms of bringing the consortium together. E&I is responsible for the carbon capture and use, the CO2 pipeline. So we're going to capture CO2 at the point of production, and we're also going to capture it from very large industrial processes along the pathway, such as Viridor, and that CO2 will be sequestered offshore in depleted oil wells. Cadent is designing, consenting the network, which I'll talk about further on. We've also got support, academic support from the University of Chester, CF Fertilizers, a very large CO2 user, Innoven, which is going to do the storage. So for hydrogen, you do need geological storage to really maximize the use case for hydrogen. So if you want to use hydrogen to decarbonize electricity generation, where they plants ramp on and ramp off, you need that flexibility to have storage in the mix. So Innoven will be providing the storage. Our colleagues at Vertex, who are going to talk later, are going to actually be producing the hydrogen, and that's in collaboration with SR because it's going to sit within the SR site, and also SR is a very large, going to be a very large consumer of hydrogen as well. And the final partner is Hansen. Next slide, please, Clive. So Cadent is working on a number of schemes, not just HyNet. So HyNet's the most advanced Track 1 cluster, but we've also got East Coast Hydrogen, and I know Clive has established relationships with East Coast, and they'll be talking to you in a couple of weeks. We're also developing hydrogen plans called Hydrogen Valley in the more central belt, and then also hydrogen for London called Capital Hydrogen. And not all of these schemes will have what we call Track 1 CCUS production. A lot of these schemes will be driven by electrolytic hydrogen, which is producing hydrogen through electrolysis, and a number of those plants will be going live sooner than HyNet. They're scheduled to go live in 2025, and they can be deployed a little bit more agilely because they take up a smaller space with a pipeline to an off-taker. Capital Hydrogen in London is again hugely important. There's a lot of very large industrial loads down in London, which we are looking, such as Stanlow, which are crying out for hydrogen. Next slide, please, Clive. So drilling in a little bit closer, so HyNet itself, on the left, the red pipeline is the carbon capture, is the CO2 pipeline, and that's going through what we call a development consent order process at the moment, and that's going to capture the CO2 from Vertex and a number of those very large emitters of CO2 along the way, and that's going to be sequestered offshore. HyNet itself is again going through a development consent order phase. So we've just been out to statutory consultation for 124 kilometres, which is this X you see on the slide in the top left. And that has been quite an extensive process, as you can imagine. There's a lot of landowners that need to be consulted on the plans to get the pipeline in. And that development consent order application is going into the planning inspectorate in September. And it's about a 14-month deliberation for the planning inspector to grant the consent to actually allow us to build, or otherwise. There's always, as with anything, you know, it's a process we need to go through. And then also shown there is the underground storage by Innoven as well. Next slide, please, Clive. And again, this schematic just kind of gives you a slightly clearer view of what I've just described. So with the CO2 going up to the left, which is the red pipeline, and then the this kind of the cross is the 124 kilometres of pipeline that we're going to be building out over the next few years. And again, our the partnership which we've got with E&I, Vertex, and Innovan. Next slide, please, Clive. We estimate the kind of regional demand for hydrogen at sort of 30 terawatt hours a year. That's kind of what we call the gettable demand, you know, between now and sort of 2035. The network itself, to get a little bit technical, is going to be 42-inch high pressure steel, and it initially is going to run at what we call 44.5 bar, but it is going to be scalable. So when we build HyNet phase 2, we will have a HyNet phase 3 which will follow on, and rather than lay new pipe, we will be able to just ramp up the pressures within the existing infrastructure. We'll also, as through this process, because it's going to be a regulated asset, we'll have more hydrogen production connected into the system, which again will drive resilience as we move forward. Next slide, please. So this does need to be coordinated though, because it's a huge system, whole system kind of thinking and approach here. So you've got Vertex, who's going to be producing the hydrogen. So they need to obviously get to what we call final investment, and they need the hydrogen business models to be in place to allow them to effectively produce the hydrogen and sell the hydrogen at a price which is comparable to natural gas. We need the funding and again for the transportation storage business models, the mechanism to allow our investors to make the investment to actually build out the network. And also Innovan need the business models as well, so that Innovan can build the hydrogen, to build the hydrogen storage. But the fourth leg to that stool or table is effectively the customers. So big industry. So big industry also needs to be prepared to take and receive the hydrogen, you know, by 2027. So it's very key that all of this is choreographed to come together as a whole system. We can't have this, you know, happen in a piecemeal fashion. So trying to coordinate with government, and government is going to play a central role in moving us forward, and we call this a cluster final investment decision. So government is going to support all of these different stakeholders to come together so we can move forward and deliver the system, the whole system, in a very uniform and joined up approach. And that's partly driven very helpfully by the announcements by government yesterday on what we call their minded two positions on the production business models which came out. Next slide, please. So that here is the network that you can see. The green is the phase 2, and then the red is the phase 3, which will come in sort of 2035. 125 kilometers of steel pipe, and we're going through the consenting process for the green at the moment. If you just move to the next slide helpfully shows where some of your hospitals are in relation to where the Cadent network is going to be going between now and sort of 2030, 2035. So this again is quite helpful, because when we get very close to your hospitals, we'll be able to provide and offer you a connection to take hydrogen into your processes, so you can then start to work through what's the best use case for hydrogen within your hospitals. But there is quite a nice correlation there in terms of network and your hospitals. And I think that was the final slide. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, we hand over to Joe.
Hi, afternoon, everybody. So I've been asked to come and present just a very quick introduction to how HyNet is actually making hydrogen. So I'm Joe Ward, I'm the engineering manager at Vertex Hydrogen, working with Martin and others across the HyNet cluster to make this happen. Vertex Hydrogen is really the company at the core of HyNet, or I say the core, the middle of HyNet, where we're making hydrogen and also exporting CO2 for capture. Clive, if you could go to the next slide, please. It's a very high-level overview of Vertex. So Vertex is a joint venture company formed with the sole purpose and mission to deliver the first 2 hydrogen plants in the northwest of the UK. We're looking to build plants at a pretty significant scale and quite quickly, so really spearheading a hydrogen economy in the northwest. The first customers that we're looking to serve are mostly large industrial customers. So if you think about things like glass manufacturing, aluminium recycling, steel manufacturing, these are single customers that today emit huge amounts of CO2, and we're looking to really fuel switch them to hydrogen to make a big dent in the region's CO2 emissions quickly. It's not any different to what we would look to do with hospitals, but we're going at those big ticket emitters first to get the economy up and running, and then we'll start thinking about things like domestic heating and transport and hospitals, etc. All that thinking needs to start now to make sure that those sectors are also ready to receive hydrogen when we are ready to produce it. So our mission is to produce 1 gigawatt of hydrogen by 2027, and 1 gigawatt may be just a concept. It was a concept to me when I started, but I'll try to explain what 1 gigawatt actually means and feels like. It's a pretty big number. Next slide then, please, Clive. So you'll see on the left-hand side the same schematic that Martin showed earlier. So it's a very high-level map of the HyNet cluster. And at the centre of the HyNet cluster, we have low-carbon hydrogen production, which is being developed by Vertex as we speak. We're developing a 1 gigawatt plant, which is split into 2 phases, and it's situated at Stanlow Manufacturing Complex near Ellesmere Port, which is on the same site as the oil refinery, which is run by SR. The plant will be situated there, but it will be connected to the CO2 store by ENI and then also regional users across the northwest by Cadent, so connecting into the Cadent network to move hydrogen across the region. The process, which I'll talk a bit more about on the next slide, noting that I'm an engineer, so please do stop me if I get too far into the details, but the process is basically looking to make hydrogen using natural gas as a feedstock. And it's absolutely critical to make that actually help in the drive for decarbonisation and net zero is extremely high levels of CO2 capture. So we're looking at plants that will capture a minimum of 97%. We're now looking at plants that will capture 99% and above of the CO2 made by the process for permanent storage in Liverpool Bay. Next slide, please, Clive. So if you dive into the heart of our process, this is a flow sheet of what's going on inside our plant. Essentially taking natural gas, mixing it with steam and oxygen, and passing it through a series of catalytic reactors at very high temperature. Essentially what that's doing is splitting a methane molecule and splitting a water molecule and turning that into streams of hydrogen and CO2. Essentially what we're trying to do here is take natural gas, pull all of the carbon molecules out of it before we then start distributing it around the northwest. If we give natural gas to people in the northwest, they'll burn the natural gas, it will turn into CO2. It's all over the place, it's really hard to capture. The concept here is we take the natural gas, before we hand it out to everyone, we strip out all of the carbon, we give it to ENI to be stored, and then we distribute around the region just hydrogen. The hydrogen, when burnt, emits no CO2 emissions. So that's overall the concept. That's what this plant is looking to do. And we do that by essentially splitting it over catalytic reactors and then stripping the CO2 out using a solvent, pressurizing the CO2, which we give to ENI. ENI then store it in Liverpool Bay, and we pressurize the hydrogen, which we give to Cadent. Cadent then hand it around the northwest region. Next slide. And this is quite a quick whistle-stop tour of what Vertex are doing, because really would love to take any questions if anyone has any in what's left of the 8 minutes I was allocated. So what is a gigawatt? And I thought this was important, right? Climate change and abating climate change quickly is absolutely critical. And the amount of energy this country uses, if you actually lay it out, is astronomical. With peak electricity demand, that's just electricity, not heat, up at 60 gigawatts. So we're looking to make 1 gigawatt of hydrogen. A gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and 1,000 megawatts is 1,000 kilowatts. and your kettle is about 3 kilowatts. So you can see this is a pretty big number of the amount of energy we're looking to make in a single plant here, but still just a small fraction of what the UK uses in total. We'll be capturing just shy of 2 million tonnes of CO2 per year once we've built the first 2 phases of our plant, which is equivalent of taking around 700,000 cars permanently off the roads of the UK. Petrol cars, petrol and diesel cars. I tried to have a think about medical context, and yeah, sorry if this is not a context you're not familiar with either. It's absolutely not context I was familiar with, but I was trying to think, what does the NHS use large amounts of carbon-based fuels for today? And the one that sprung to mind, which is a bit different maybe to other industries, is medical incineration. So a medical incinerator, industrial scale, can burn 3 tonnes of medical waste each day, or the one that's pictured here. I'm sure there are bigger and smaller. And today these burn diesel, LPG and natural gas as fuel. All of those emit CO2. The one that you can see here is rated for 740 kilowatts of fuel. So the hydrogen we're producing at Vertex could essentially, if we had the incinerator technology, provide 1,350 of these incinerators, which is actually more than the number of hospitals in the UK. So to give you an idea of just the sheer scale of hydrogen we're looking to produce in a low carbon way, it is enough hydrogen just in these 2 phases to theoretically eliminate fuel-based CO2 emissions from medical incineration in the UK. Not what we're planning to use the first tranche of hydrogen for, but just to give you a feel of scale. That's everything from me, Clive. Very happy to take questions about the way we're making hydrogen or anything else.
Great. Well, people can put those in the chat for starting point, and then we'll go from there.
Sure.
Because
okay, thank you.
Because the size of HyNet and the timescales, I asked Grenian, who the other end of the market, to tell us about how they're producing hydrogen, and you can have a look at what they do and how they do it and the timescales for that as well. So over to you there.
Yeah, hi, nice to speak with you all. So I'm Joseph Bailey. I work for Progressive Energy, who have a joint venture, Grenian Hydrogen. That'll explain more about what that's about going forward. I'm a project manager, so I'm responsible for the day-to-day delivery of our existing project portfolio. Just for those who maybe aren't familiar with green hydrogen, sometimes we're also referred to as electrolytic hydrogen. So it's a low carbon hydrogen production technology, similar to the Vertex Hydrogen producing low carbon hydrogen as well. The big difference is we produce our hydrogen from renewable energy and water. So there's no kind of natural gas or carbon capture in the process. It comes inherently from renewable sources. If you go to the next slide, Clive. So Grenian Hydrogen, so we're a joint venture between Progressive Energy, Statkraft and Foresight. So Progressive Energy, the company that I work for, is a low carbon project development organization. We've actually been developing low carbon projects for 25 years and doing low carbon hydrogen development for 25 years. And I think you'd struggle to find other companies who have spent that long in the UK working solely on low carbon project development as we have. We're then partnered with Statkraft, who's the Norwegian state-owned power company. They're Europe's largest renewable energy generator. They're also have the most number of power purchase agreements in the UK for renewable energy. So very large organization with lots of renewable power to sell and supply. And then we work with Foresight, who are an infrastructure investment group who specialize in low carbon infrastructure investments. They do a lot of solar and wind development. And then what's kind of shown is our joint venture Grenian, and then we have a number of projects which kind of sit beneath those in our kind of corporate structure, and I'll talk about those on the next slide. So our existing portfolio is centered around the northwest of England and North Wales. That's really related to the fact that HyNet in that area, being one of the most developed hydrogen markets in the UK at the moment, makes it a very attractive place to do business. However, there's nothing kind of stopping us looking at other areas, and this technology is very much deployable across the UK and doesn't rely on the kind of large network development that HyNet is delivering. So we're working with a number of industrial sites. You can see there from companies you may know like Kellogg's and Tata and Pilkington's, but we're also working on some bigger projects which are seen as cluster development. So where you say have an industrial estate with lots of different users who are currently using natural gas and want to decarbonize, we're looking to develop these kind of local networks of hydrogen supply, and that's kind of shown by the Speak and Wrexham diagrams. You jump onto the next slide, Clive. In terms of the kind of size of projects that we're doing at the moment, so our most advanced project in the kind of shortlisted category is CGH. And what I mean by shortlisted is there are government competitions for green hydrogen project development. CGH is shortlisted along with 20 other projects for a government support contract, and that would then due to be operational by 2025. That's our kind of most advanced project and our leader. We then have a series of slightly smaller projects which are co-located with industrial sites, so around about the 10 to 15 megawatt scale, and I believe that's probably quite similar to the gas demand, a number of the kind of NHS trusts that are on the call today. So to kind of convert that into a megawatt thermal, you can take a rough efficiency guide of sort of 70% for the process. So if you're putting in kind of 15 megawatts, you're getting something like 11 megawatt thermal for use in your boilers or the incinerators and things that Joe just mentioned. And what this also kind of shows in terms of our portfolio is how quickly we're ramping up. So I joined Progressive last June. At that time, we actually only had the CGH project that we were actively developing. You kind of go forward a year later and we've got 200 megawatt projects, and our expectation is this to grow and grow. And just to give you kind of sense of scale of that kind of 200 megawatts, so that's 252,000 tons of CO2 per annum, an equivalent to 32,000 homes. So these really are making a material difference in terms of the UK's decarbonisation plans. If you go to the next slide. Just to explain kind of how that business model and how the interaction would work with the site. So we would look to basically lease or purchase land on or adjacent to the trust. Would be a preference for sites that do have land around them as the kind of first tranche of projects, but then could look for kind of more complicated land for later projects. Once we've kind of identified the plot of land and it's suitably sized, Grenian would then basically develop the electrolyzer and the hydrogen production plant. In order to do that, we need to connect into services. So we would need a grid connection or local renewables such as wind and solar nearby. We'd need a water connection. We have to tie into drainage networks. It's really helpful if sites have existing facilities and existing capacities, but it's not a firm requirement. We can also look to establish these things ourselves with local utility companies. We produce the hydrogen on site. We then basically sell it over the fence to the off-taker. You would then basically use it in whatever equipment to replace natural gas. Our kind of current portfolio is things like boilers, burners, furnaces, but we'd have to get an understanding of what equipment you have on site that uses natural gas. We sell under the hydrogen business model hydrogen at the same price as natural gas. So in terms of your energy costs, you shouldn't see any net increase in the energy costs in moving from natural gas to hydrogen. In order to do that, we receive subsidy support from the government to pay for the difference in natural gas generation costs versus hydrogen. However, you would need to invest in order to have hydrogen-ready equipment. From the work we've done with others, particularly if we're talking about heating, it tends to be relatively minor upgrades. So you may have pipe work, valves, metering, and you may have some modifications required to the burner. But those are typically fairly modest costs. However, again, each site would need to kind of look at their own processes and establish the business case for that. If you go on to the next slide, Clive. So just in terms of timelines, so our timelines are governed by government processes. So we couldn't do this without government support. The first, the government support schemes are termed hydrogen allocation rounds. They're basically competitive processes where projects bid for levels of support funding, and then the best projects get funding and advance. So the current HAR1 process opened last year, and that's for projects due to be operational by 2025. The next HAR2 process opens end of this year for projects operational 2026, 2029. Government hasn't published timelines beyond that point, but they've indicated we would expect there to be a HAR process in 2025 for later operational dates and so on and so on. Now, the minimum project size is a 5 megawatt thermal peak capacity, which I don't know if that rules out some trusts from looking at green hydrogen as an option if you're low gas demand sites. But basically, so long as your demand is kind of above the 5 megawatt thermal, we should be able to qualify. And I've just flagged some other schemes that may be available to support. I don't know about specific things that are available to trusts, but a lot of the sites we work with get support through the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund. There's also the Industrial Fuel Switching Programme. We also get kind of development support via the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund. So there may also be schemes out there that trusts can tap into in order to support kind of demonstration and development work for hydrogen use on the site. If you go to the next slide, Clive. And just the last slide from me, just wanted to show an example kind of timeline and process. So starting from where we are today, if people were interested in engaging further, we would look to basically identify the right sites and look to enter into some kind of understanding around project definition and ways of working. We would then look to do a feasibility study where we would basically assess how likely is it that we can get the grid connection, the water we need, have enough footprint for the electrolyzer, but then also look at how we can match that to your kind of offtake profile. You would need to basically look at your hydrogen readiness plan. So what changes do you need to make to the sites in order to be able to use hydrogen? Do you need to upgrade equipment? Do you need to install pipework? We then enter into a kind of more developed design phase for our green hydrogen facility. Similarly, we would expect sites to look more in depth at those upgrades that I mentioned. I think then realistically, we would be looking to bid these into the HAR3 process, because I think the timeline of doing that by next year is probably too tight for both parties involved. But bid into HAR3 would expect to then basically be awarded government contracts and take FID early 2026. And we believe then we could be operational, so using hydrogen and decarbonize the site by 2028. I can see we've got a hand. Can't see quite who the person is, but welcome to ask the question.
It's just me. They are running out of time. That's what my hand's for.
Well, perfectly timed, I think, Lorna.
Okay, so I'll pick up from here. So you've clearly got an idea from that last slide about the timescales. If you wanted to be in the first wave of green hydrogen, and what it would take and when you'd be done. So therefore, it's, you know, and then you've heard the options for the HyNet itself coming in later in the decade. I think the key thing to us is we're going to have to move in groups of hospitals, depending upon how hard it is to do our particular site. So things like the site condition, backlog, the condition of your plant and your buildings and your energy usage are all important. The funding required for your site to be ready is an issue. The opportunity, particularly geography and timescales, matter. So you'll see some hospitals are closer to the HyNet initial pipe work than others. Two are particularly close. And then there is also things to do with the actual load, and you've heard about that. If your site was 5 megawatts or above, then you might want to consider Grenian type systems. But if you weren't, but you had an ecosystem around you of people who could share the hydrogen with you, that would also apply. And some of these things apply to the consideration of geothermal and other such methods of getting to net zero. Particular issues might be for most of the technologies to net zero, we're looking at de-steaming sites. Hydrogen's the one that would allow you to retain steam, though I'm not yet aware of any steam hydrogen boilers, but I think they're on their way. And if you were a site that had bad steam plant that needed replacement anyway, and we're going to de-steam you, then that's capital intensive, and that might be a project that might take several years to do. So these projects need to be grouped, and that's the idea of this collaboration between the trust, is that we collect ourselves into groups and go forward in a collective manner so we can share the amount of work involved, how we sort funding, how we sort costs out, and the rest of it. So interesting. The most interesting about hydrogen also is that it's subsidised to the price of gas. And whilst it might be a funny concept to use hydrogen from renewables to produce electricity, you certainly could produce it from the HyNet hydrogen. You could run through CHP plants, and we will at HyNet have two CHP manufacturers who can give you CHP plant with hydrogen trains on it, or even adapt some of the existing CHPs. Geothermal schemes, district energy schemes, and hydrogen may pay for themselves over time, particularly geothermal, where once you've done it, the heat coming out the ground is free. District energy, if it's linked to geothermal, is quite predictable, and hydrogen will at least be predictable, and it's linked to the gas price. Obviously, the effect of a contract for difference is the gas price goes up for other people, which hopefully will get them on side, and then there might be HV solutions as well. Okay. So this set of talks is all about trying to support trusts, and you can use that support or not. It's up to you. We've had the kickoff meetings in July. We've got the technology meetings, of which this is the first today, and then we'll have them every week on a Thursday for the rest of this month. And then we will have the repeat talk. So if you've missed this, you'll get the recording on the website if you want to use it, or you can attend the meeting in September when we repeat it on a Wednesday, just for people who don't work Thursdays. At HyNet, we'll have workshops where intention is that you can meet trusts, you can meet the providers, you can meet the kind of people who've been speaking to you today. We'll try and start grouping you into trusts that could work together, so that you can go out with an idea of the timescales and the rest of it, and having talked to one of the providers at that workshop to get the questions and issues sorted out in your head. We're looking to put on some roadshow in November, December. That's made it a lighter shade blue because we're still working it out. And then we're working out what support you might need from next year onwards, or want, actually, because the idea is, does it help you? I see some questions about emissions trading and the rest of it. We'll see whether we get a chance to pick any of these up now. Otherwise, the questions, we'll circulate the questions and put the questions and answers on the collaboration website. Just so you've got an idea of the talks. Next week got geothermal, and they're more than half the biggest hospitals in the country can potentially get geothermal. We got district heating and offsite options on the 17th of August, and then East Coast Hydrogen on the 24th. So I was wrong when I said it was 2 weeks away. It's 3 weeks away, East Coast Hydrogen, which will also go into some of the other zones as well. And then we've got, for the trusts that to which any of the above are not really good options, we've got some technologies for the end of the month where we're looking at either decarbonisation of gas on or near your site directly. We're looking for trial sites for next year for that now, and other methods of getting there. We don't intend to cover heat pumps because we believe the NHS is got competent with those, but no doubt I can put you onto somebody to help you if you're struggling. And then we've got the workshops at HyNet. The 11th is Hydrogen Day, so we'll do the workshops on the HyNet and the East Coast Hydrogen that day, and the 10th is the others, so geothermal, decarbonisation of gas, and various other solutions will be on that day there. Watching the time a bit. The objectives by the end of HyNet, I know you've got to have a plan together for the end of March, but for our end of HyNet, we hope you will have an idea of which trusts you can work with, an understanding of the route that might suit you for your net zero program, and you might have an idea of what the sort of timescales are for you. Are you a trust that's going to sit around until 2028 and perhaps join a hydrogen program, or you want to do that, but you've got to do some site conversion first, and then, or whatever. And then for the road shows, we hope to be able to give you some information to put outline business case or a strategic outline case costs and savings against the different technologies we have. That's quite an ambitious goal, but we're trying to do that now. Okay, so I'll probably cover most of these. The whole point is about collaboration and trying to network you and the rest of it. So I think that covers the slides. We may want to pick up some of the questions. Because I've been making the slides, I need one of the speakers to perhaps pick up a question that you think is there. We've seen some about efficiency that weren't answered in the call, and I've seen some answers that are around. Does anybody want to pick up a question from the team? Okay, I'll turn the slides off. Any other speakers? We've had the efficiency of hydrogen. You can electrolysis. We heard that 15 megawatts in gets you 10 to 11 megawatts of heat out. We've heard that the HyNet, the cracking is, we're trying to get to 85% or so. I've seen that in the slide. We haven't had a question particularly about funding, but we've seen some of that covered. The schemes that pay for themselves, we're looking at collaborative sources of funding, and I've written to the UK Investment Bank with a list of trusts, and I've asked them for 2.2 billion. So let's see what they say about that. And I think we've picked up the efficiency ones. Has anybody else got a question they want to answer verbally on the call? Joe Ward, is there anything you want to pick up? You guys are muted if you do sign speak.
No, I don't think anything specific for me on the chat. But if you do see anything that you need an answer on, do just let me know afterwards.
I'll circulate the questions, and you can add your answers to them, and then I'll post them on the website before this repeat of this call. So it will give us a week or two to do this. Martin, anything from your side? Any questions you want to pick up?
I don't think there's anything specific there for me, but again, as like Joe, if you collate any questions, Clive, we will give a detailed response.
Okay, so we will accept if people send us questions on this chat, or subsequently we'll add them to the list. Joseph, anything from your side that you want to pick up?
No, just echo the comments. Happy to respond to anything post meeting. We'll also be there on the at the next meeting in September if people have follow-up questions.
Excellent. Okay. Right. Everybody on this call is a volunteer. The trusts, thank you for coming. Some are in the HyNet and some aren't. Thank you for coming. I hope this is interesting to you. The talkers have volunteered, given their time. They're all very busy, as you might expect. So it's just been a generally voluntary thing. I'll give the last word to Steve Lowndes if you want to. Steve, do you want to talk about the financial models or the efficiency at all, or do you think it's been covered adequately in the chat?
I think we've been picking most of it up in the chat. I think somebody's asked about whether or not there is a list of sites that we think are in the various hydrogen zones. I was trying to refine the question, but I've lost it in the thread now.
Well, you have a clue in the form of invite you got from me. So if you got an invite from me saying that you were in the thing, then you are. And if you got an invite saying, would you like to attend, then you aren't. But remember, there's also the East Coast one coming up, and the same for geothermal and the rest of it. So if you're in the geothermal area, you'll get an invite that says you really should come to this if you can, because it should be interesting to you. And if you're not lucky enough to look like you're in the list, then you'll get an invite saying you want to sit in on it. So I'll try to give you a nudge in that direction, but we do have a list. And if you want to ask, we can show you the national map. We can show you the technologies you mapped against, and you know what options are available to you. We have all that information together, but you will get a clue from the invites. Does that cover it, Stephen?
I think so. Yes, I think so for the time being. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. Thank you for all attending. Thank you to the speakers. We will get more or less the same team of speakers together for the repeat. So if somebody's missed this or somebody important needs to hear it, they can either listen to the recording. I know a recording is a lovely thing because it's always there, but it's not a lovely thing because you can leave it to tomorrow, where sometimes having a date and an appointment kind of makes it all actually happen. So there will be a repeat of this, more or less the same speakers, more or less the same content for people who have missed it. But thank you all for your time and attending this call.